On November 29, 1987, Korean Air Flight 858 prepared for what should have been another routine international journey. The Boeing 707 had already completed part of its route and was continuing its scheduled trip towards Seoul, South Korea, carrying 115 people from different walks of life. Business executives returning from overseas assignments, construction workers heading home after months abroad, airline crew members performing another ordinary shift, and travelers eager to reunite with their families all shared one thing in common. None of them believed they were boarding what would become one of the most devastating acts of aviation terrorism in modern history. The atmosphere inside the aircraft was calm. Flight attendants welcomed passengers with practiced smiles while helping them store their luggage. Conversations filled the cabin as people settled into their seats. Some opened newspapers. Others leaned back, hoping to catch a few hours of sleep before reaching home. For many, this flight marked the final leg of a long journey. Loved ones in South Korea were already making plans to meet them at the airport. Among those passengers were two individuals who blended in perfectly. They attracted no unusual attention. Their clothing was simple. Their behavior was polite. Their documents appeared authentic. To airport officials, they were simply Japanese tourists, a middle-aged father traveling with his adult daughter. Their passports were examined, stamped, and returned without concern. Their luggage passed through security alongside everyone else's. Nothing about them suggested danger. Yet hidden inside one of their bags was a carefully concealed explosive device, disguised as ordinary personal belongings. It had been designed to remain unnoticed until long after its owners had left the aircraft. The passengers seated around them had no idea they were sitting beside people carrying out a mission planned months, perhaps years, in advance. The pilots knew nothing. The cabin crew noticed nothing. Airport security detected nothing. The countdown had already begun. To understand why Flight 858 became a target, it is necessary to travel back decades, to a conflict that never truly ended. When the Korean War ceased in 1953, peace never officially arrived. Fighting stopped under an armistice agreement, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North Korea and South Korea remained at war, separated by one of the world's most heavily fortified borders. Over the following decades, the two countries moved in completely different directions. South Korea experienced remarkable economic growth. Cities expanded rapidly, industries flourished, and diplomatic relationships with nations around the world strengthened. The country transformed itself into one of Asia's fastest-growing economies, eager to prove its place on the international stage. North Korea, meanwhile, remained isolated under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. Information from outside the country was tightly controlled. Loyalty to the government became central to everyday life, and intelligence operations were regarded as an essential part of national security. Relations between the two Koreas remained deeply hostile. There were armed infiltrations across the border, espionage missions, political assassinations, bomb attacks, military confrontations. Although large-scale war had ended, the conflict continued in different forms, often carried out by intelligence agencies working in secrecy. By the mid-1980s, another event dramatically increased tensions. South Korea had won the right to host the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul. For South Korea, the Olympics represented much more than an international sporting competition. They were an opportunity to demonstrate decades of economic progress and political stability before the entire world. Millions of visitors were expected. Thousands of journalists would travel to Seoul. Television broadcasts would introduce South Korea to billions of viewers across the globe. According to South Korean investigators, North Korea viewed this as a major political victory for its rival. Authorities later concluded that disrupting international confidence before the Games had become an important objective. If fear could be created, if foreign governments questioned South Korea's security, if visitors stayed away, the Olympics themselves might suffer. Whether those conclusions fully explain what happened remains debated, but investigators would later argue that Korean Air Flight 858 became part of that larger political conflict. At the center of the operation was a young woman whose life had been shaped almost entirely by the North Korean state. Her name was Kim Hyon-hui. Born in Pyongyang in 1962, she grew up in a family that enjoyed privileges unavailable to most North Koreans. Her father served as a diplomat, exposing her to opportunities that set her apart from many of her peers. She was intelligent, disciplined, an excellent student. She developed a remarkable ability to learn foreign languages, especially Japanese. Years later, Kim would explain that from childhood she had been taught to believe complete loyalty to her country was life's highest duty. Every lesson in school reinforced devotion to the leadership. National service was presented as an honor beyond question. As she matured, her talents drew the attention of North Korea's intelligence services. According to her later testimony, she was selected for specialized training that transformed her from an ordinary student into an undercover operative. The training was exhaustive. She learned surveillance techniques, forgery, false identities, secret communications, counter-surveillance. She memorized Japanese customs, practiced accents until they sounded natural, and studied behavior closely enough to convince strangers she had spent her entire life in Japan. Mistakes were unacceptable. An undercover operative who hesitated could expose an entire mission. Absolute obedience became the foundation of her training. She later claimed she never questioned the assignments she received because she believed serving her country outweighed every personal consideration. By 1987, years of preparation had produced an agent capable of traveling internationally without attracting suspicion. Then came the assignment that would define the rest of her life. She was paired with an older intelligence officer named Kim Hyon-hui. Together, they were instructed to assume false Japanese identities and travel through several countries before boarding a South Korean commercial aircraft. Their mission, according to Kim's later confession, was chillingly simple. Board the aircraft. Leave behind a timed explosive. Exit during a scheduled stopover. Allow the bomb to destroy the aircraft after departure. There would be no confrontation. No hijacking. No demands. No warning. The passengers would never know they had been chosen as targets. The operation depended entirely on remaining invisible. Over the following weeks, the pair traveled across Europe and the Middle East, passing through immigration checkpoints without difficulty. Every successful border crossing strengthened their cover. Every passport stamp made them appear even more legitimate. No alarms were raised. No intelligence agency intercepted them. No airport official suspected the quiet father and daughter moving calmly from one international terminal to another. Finally, they arrived in Baghdad. Waiting on the tarmac was Korean Air Flight 858. Within a few hours, one ordinary boarding process would become the beginning of an international tragedy that would leave 115 people dead and send investigators on a search that would eventually lead to one of the world's most secretive governments. The boarding process at Baghdad International Airport unfolded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. Passengers presented their boarding passes, handed over their passports, and walked through the departure gate without concern. Airline employees performed their duties with routine efficiency, while baggage handlers loaded luggage into the aircraft's cargo hold. Among the stream of travelers were Kim Hyon-hui and Kim Hyon-hui. To everyone around them, they remained exactly what their forged passports claimed they were: Japanese tourists nearing the end of an overseas journey. They smiled when spoken to, answered questions politely, and avoided drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Years of intelligence training had prepared them for moments like this. The less people remembered seeing them, the greater their chances of success. According to Kim Hyon-hui's later confession, the explosive device had been carefully disguised to avoid suspicion. Investigators later said it consisted of explosives hidden inside a portable radio, with another component concealed in a liquor bottle. To anyone casually looking at the luggage, the items appeared completely ordinary. Airport security in the late 1980s was far different from what travelers experience today. Advanced explosive detection systems were uncommon. Screening procedures varied from airport to airport, and security largely depended on X-ray machines, manual inspections, and the judgment of security personnel. The device passed through without being discovered. As the aircraft departed Baghdad, nothing seemed unusual. Passengers relaxed into their seats. Some looked out of the windows as the city disappeared beneath the clouds. Others spoke quietly with fellow travelers or flipped through magazines to pass the time. Flight attendants moved through the cabin serving refreshments, answering requests, and preparing for the next scheduled stop. No one realized that somewhere inside the aircraft was a device counting down toward disaster. Korean Air Flight 858 followed a multi-leg international route, making scheduled stops before reaching its final destination in Seoul. One of those stops was Abu Dhabi. When the aircraft landed, many passengers remained seated while others prepared to leave or board, depending on their travel plans. Among those leaving the aircraft were Kim Hyon-hui and Kim Seung-il. They gathered their personal belongings with calm precision, thanked the cabin crew, and stepped off the aircraft just as any ordinary passengers would. But they deliberately left one bag behind. Inside that bag was the explosive device. Nothing about the abandoned luggage immediately appeared suspicious. Passengers occasionally forgot personal belongings on international flights, and unattended items were not automatically treated as security threats in the way they are today. The aircraft prepared for departure once again. Ground crews completed their final checks. The doors were secured. The engines came alive. Within minutes, Korean Air Flight 858 lifted back into the sky. This time, without the two people who had planted the bomb. As the Boeing 707 cruised over the Andaman Sea, life inside the cabin continued as though nothing had changed. Some passengers slept peacefully. Others chatted quietly with the people beside them. Crew members continued serving drinks and checking on passengers. The pilots monitored their instruments, maintaining contact with air traffic control while guiding the aircraft along its planned route. Everything appeared normal. Then, without warning, communication stopped. Air traffic controllers attempted to contact the aircraft. There was no reply. They called again. Silence. Controllers considered the possibility of radio failure, a problem that occasionally interrupted communication between aircraft and ground stations. They continued trying to establish contact. Nothing. Minutes turned into hours. The aircraft never responded. Search efforts began as concern quickly spread through aviation authorities. At first, there remained hope that the aircraft had experienced technical difficulties and diverted to another airport. Perhaps the radios had failed. Perhaps an emergency landing had taken place somewhere beyond the range of communication. But as time passed, those possibilities became increasingly unlikely. Korean Air Flight 858 had disappeared. Investigators would later conclude that the bomb exploded while the aircraft was flying over the Andaman Sea, causing it to break apart in midair. All 115 people aboard were killed. No distress signal was received. No emergency transmission was sent. The destruction happened so suddenly that the crew had little or no opportunity to report what was happening. Back in South Korea, families waited anxiously for news. Airport arrival boards continued displaying scheduled information, even as officials struggled to understand why the aircraft had failed to arrive. Some relatives refused to believe the worst. Others sensed that something terrible had happened long before any official announcement was made. For many families, the uncertainty became almost as painful as the truth itself. While investigators searched for answers, the two intelligence operatives believed their mission had been completed successfully. They continued traveling toward Bahrain, still carrying their forged Japanese passports. If everything had gone according to plan, they expected to leave the Middle East without anyone realizing who they really were. But fate intervened in an unexpected way. When immigration officers in Bahrain examined their passports, something didn't seem right. The documents raised suspicion. Officials noticed irregularities that prompted further questioning. Instead of being allowed to continue their journey, Kim Hyon-hui and Kim Seung-il were detained. The operation that had been planned with extraordinary precision was beginning to unravel. Unknown to the pair, investigators were already trying to determine why a South Korean airliner had vanished from the sky. Within hours, the two quiet travelers who had escaped the aircraft unnoticed would become the focus of an international investigation, one that neither of them had ever intended to survive. Kim Hyon-hui and Kim Seung-il had been trained for many possibilities. They had learned how to create convincing false identities, how to avoid surveillance, and how to remain calm during questioning. But there was one situation they had been instructed never to allow: capture. According to Kim's later testimony, both operatives had been issued cyanide capsules concealed inside cigarettes. If arrest became unavoidable, they were expected to take their own lives rather than risk revealing information about the mission or the organization behind it. As immigration officials in Bahrain questioned the pair about their passports, the situation quickly escalated. Realizing that their cover was beginning to collapse, the two operatives acted. They bit into the cyanide capsules. Within moments, Kim Seung-il collapsed. Despite attempts to save him, he died shortly afterward. Kim Hyon-hui also swallowed cyanide, but emergency medical treatment prevented the poison from killing her. Her survival would change the course of the investigation. Instead of two dead suspects, authorities now had a living witness who could potentially explain what had happened to Korean Air Flight 858. At first, Kim remained committed to her cover story. She insisted she was Japanese. She claimed Kim Seung-il was her father. She denied any involvement in terrorism. Years of training had taught her never to admit the truth. Investigators, however, were unconvinced. Experts carefully examined the passports and determined they had been forged. Language specialists noticed subtle inconsistencies in her speech. Although she spoke Japanese fluently, there were expressions and cultural details that did not quite match someone raised in Japan. Her personal history also began to fall apart under closer examination. Authorities reconstructed the pair's journey through multiple countries, comparing immigration records, airline manifests, and passport stamps. The evidence painted a clear picture. The two travelers had boarded Korean Air Flight 858 in Baghdad. They had left the aircraft during its stop in Abu Dhabi. Shortly afterward, the aircraft disappeared from radar. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Kim was eventually transferred to South Korea, where investigators continued questioning her. Faced with overwhelming evidence, her story began to change. According to South Korean authorities, she confessed. She admitted that her name was not the one written in her passport. She identified herself as Kim Hyon-hui, an operative of North Korea's intelligence service. She described years of specialized training that had prepared her to operate overseas under false identities. She explained how she had learned foreign languages, memorized fictional biographies, and practiced living as someone else. Most importantly, she admitted taking part in the operation that destroyed Korean Air Flight 858. According to her confession, She and Kim Hyon-hui had received direct instructions to plant the explosive device aboard the aircraft and leave it behind during the scheduled stop in Abu Dhabi. She said they believed they were carrying out an important mission for their country. Kim later claimed she had never questioned the order. From childhood, she said, she had been taught that absolute loyalty to the North Korean state was the highest duty a citizen could fulfill. Disobeying an assignment from the leadership was unthinkable. She later described living in a world where information was tightly controlled and where the outside world was portrayed as an enemy. According to her own account, she viewed the mission not as the murder of innocent civilians, but as an act of patriotic service. It was only after leaving North Korea and spending time in South Korea, she said, that she began to understand the human cost of what had happened. South Korean investigators concluded that the bombing had been ordered by North Korean intelligence as part of an effort to intimidate the international community ahead of the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. North Korea has consistently denied involvement in the attack and rejected responsibility for the bombing. The case quickly became an international issue. Governments around the world condemned the destruction of the aircraft. Security experts examined the weaknesses in international aviation that had allowed the bomb to pass undetected. The attack renewed concerns about state-sponsored terrorism during one of the most politically tense periods of the Cold War. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were left to confront an unbearable reality. Many had spent days hoping their loved ones might somehow be found alive. Now they were forced to accept that there would be no survivors. No final phone calls. No chance to say goodbye. For many relatives, the lack of recoverable remains made the loss even more painful. The ocean had claimed almost everything. As the investigation came to a close, attention shifted from uncovering the truth to determining Kim Hyon-hui's fate. The woman who had admitted helping destroy an airliner carrying 115 innocent people now faced trial in South Korea. The outcome would become one of the most controversial decisions in the country's modern legal history. In 1989, Kim Hyon-hui stood before a South Korean court charged for her role in the bombing of Korean Air Flight 858. The evidence presented against her was substantial. Investigators had reconstructed the movements of the two operatives from the moment they began their journey through Europe and the Middle East. Airline records, immigration documents, forensic examinations of the forged passports, and Kim's own confession formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. For the families of the 115 victims, the trial represented far more than a legal proceeding. It was the closest they would ever come to hearing an explanation for why their loved ones had never returned home. Each victim had left behind a story. Parents who would never see their children again. Children who would grow up without mothers or fathers. Husbands and wives whose final conversations had ended with promises to meet again in just a few hours. Entire futures had disappeared over the Andaman Sea. When the court delivered its verdict, Kim Hyon-hui was found guilty and sentenced to death. To many observers, the decision seemed inevitable. She had admitted participating in an operation that resulted in the deaths of 115 innocent people. The crime had shocked the world and highlighted the devastating consequences of terrorism against civilian aircraft. Yet the story did not end with a death sentence. Only months later, South Korean President Roh Tae-woo granted Kim a full pardon. The decision immediately divided public opinion. The South Korean government explained that Kim had spent her entire life under intense political indoctrination and had acted as an instrument of the North Korean regime rather than as an independent planner of the attack. Officials argued that the people who designed and ordered the bombing bore the greatest responsibility. Kim, they believed, had been conditioned from childhood to obey without question. Some accepted that reasoning. Others rejected it completely. Critics argued that regardless of her upbringing, she had willingly participated in an attack that deliberately targeted innocent civilians. Supporters of the pardon believed that understanding the system that shaped her did not excuse the crime, but helped explain how such an act became possible. Even decades later, that debate continues. Following her release, Kim Hyon-hui entered a life very different from the one she had always known. Because of security concerns, South Korean authorities placed her under government protection. She lived quietly, away from public attention, as officials feared she could become the target of retaliation. In 1993, she published a memoir titled The Tears of My Soul, describing her childhood in North Korea, her recruitment into the intelligence service, and the mission that changed her life forever. In interviews over the years, she expressed remorse for the victims and their families. She said that only after leaving North Korea did she begin to understand the value of the lives that had been lost. She described feeling overwhelming guilt for carrying out a mission that had taken 115 innocent lives. Some relatives of the victims accepted her expressions of remorse. Others believed no apology could ever be enough. For many families, healing was impossible because there was no way to recover what had been taken from them. The bombing of Korean Air Flight 858 also had lasting consequences beyond the courtroom. Governments around the world strengthened aviation security, expanding screening procedures and placing greater emphasis on detecting concealed explosives. The attack became one of several incidents that demonstrated how vulnerable international air travel remained during the 1980s. For historians, the bombing is remembered as one of the most significant acts of aviation terrorism before the 21st century. It also remains one of the most controversial episodes in the history of relations between North and South Korea. South Korea has consistently maintained that North Korean agents carried out the attack under orders from their government. North Korea has consistently denied any involvement. Because of the political divide between the two countries, many aspects of the operation remain difficult to investigate independently. What is beyond dispute, however, is the human tragedy. 115 people boarded an aircraft expecting to arrive home. They never did. There was no warning, no opportunity to escape, no final farewell. Just a routine flight that disappeared into history. Nearly 4 decades later, Korean Air Flight 858 remains a powerful reminder of the human cost of political violence. Behind every headline were real people with ordinary lives, parents, friends, colleagues, sons, daughters, and dreamers whose futures ended in a single act of terror. Their names may not all be widely remembered, but the lesson their story leaves behind continues to resonate around the world. Sometimes the deadliest weapons are not those carried openly. Sometimes they are hidden behind ordinary smiles, forged identities, and quiet passengers who never attract a second glance. And sometimes, history is changed forever before anyone realizes the danger was already on board. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy deeply researched documentaries on true crime, espionage, and the world's most fascinating mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to Whispered Pages and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary.